than we've been able to greet in the past. And of course, this format is so much more accessible for many of our members. So that's a really great positive. So thank you again, and really looking forward to today. I think I have to start by thanking the Children in Scotland team, our board of directors, and our members and partners, particularly for their support over the last few months, undoubtedly since the pandemic lockdown. It's been quite, when we think about the changes all of you are going through, and I think we're all still absorbing the shock and the change that have come about. And I think I'm so proud of the Children in Scotland team, so grateful to our board of directors and others that we've actually been able to continue and demonstrate our values-based, inclusive approach, and focused on how we want to work and improve children's lives and contribute to all the work that you do. So we've managed to keep going, and in fact do more, I think, do many things better than we had in the past. But it's undoubtedly been a huge learning curve for all of us. And I hope, if you can bear with me, just to reflect on how far we've come and really what a huge change it's been for us. In March this year, we were reflecting back on 2019 as being a hugely successful year. Our events team had won awards for the quality of our events and committed to really engaging the children's sector in networking, learning, improving together. And it was fabulous to get that tribute from the industry in terms of the professionalism of our events. And we had so many plans about how we were going to build on that success. So that was fantastic. And as I said, a key aspect of how Children in Scotland wants to work. We want to be known as the organisation that brings together networks of peers and professionals, and along with children and their families, about how we improve together. And we were really delighted with that tribute to us. Also, we had really gone from strength to strength in relation to the variety of ways that we were able to work alongside children and young people who gave their time to us to work with us on improving services and policies. And also Scotland's place, for example, Scotland's place in Europe. So that was absolutely fantastic, and a huge learning for us as well about how we can meaningfully engage with children and young people and make sure that they are absolutely central to how key decisions, and in fact all decisions that affect them and their communities and lives, how they make a difference. So it was a fabulous year, and really thank you so much to those children and young people who participated and worked with us last year, and many of whom still continue to do that. And I think also we were really pleased to be able to play our part in contributing to service and policy improvement across Scotland, in particular in our services around childcare in North East Glasgow, in a range of out-of-school and holiday provision, and also in relation to how we were supporting children and their families, those children and young people with additional support for learning needs. So we're still absorbing the changes we've made, having really gone from strength to strength up until March. And I'm really proud of how we're learning and developing in response to the needs of our members. And in terms of where we are now, our events team, for example, having gone from a hugely successful, as I've said, delivery, they have now moved all our learning online. We have an amazing program, and we have doubled the number of participants in our training program that we saw in 2019, and we expect that success to continue with a new international flavour as well. So an amazing achievement in just a few months by them, and again one that shows some of the strengths and benefits of our learning. We, again, as always, of course, children and young people who, as I've said, we'd worked so well with, they have responded and taught us so much about how meaningful participation, engagement, and real influence in decision-making, how that can work and work really well. And despite some challenges, how it can work really, really well in this current context. And we will never go back to some of the other ways or the old ways of working. I know children and young people were very frustrated often with older folk and the lack of use of technology, unlike them. And I think we've, you know, a tribute to them. I think we've certainly learned a lot, and I think as most of society has. And I think most importantly, I think if we as a sector look at the last few months, I think we will all be motivated and energized by some of the negatives that we've seen, the manifest inequalities that have been exposed by this pandemic. I mean exposed, you are well used to those, you know them, you work and tackle those every day. But my goodness, the consequences of our inequality in Scotland has really been shown. And how incredible the response has been. And I think if we look at what we've achieved over the last few months in Scotland to support children and young people, I think, you know, I think it is truly, I can't even say mind-blowing, it's truly blown. I just highlighted some things for me. In these last few months, in this really difficult time, we have made unlawful the physical punishment of children as a result of incredible campaigning and influencing work that's been done by the sector. We've begun the process of incorporating Uncrc into Scottish law. An incredible culmination of years of campaigning and such a progressive approach. We've committed to implementing the overhaul of the care system in Scotland with love at its heart, again, as a result of a huge movement of children, young people and their partners to finally make a difference to the care system, building on the strengths and improvements that we've seen, but nevertheless, a dramatic move forward is expected over the next few years. We've committed to the government and COSLA, and I know all of us will be committed to implementing as well the recommendations of the Angela Morgan review of the implementation of the Additional Support for Learning Act. Absolutely critical that we get it right, and of course can't be decoupled from our work around the care review. And really critically, of course, poverty issues dominate for us and for all of us, and the concern about how bad things are now and potentially could get worse. But we have in Scotland introduced the Scottish childcare payment. Other charities have also done a lot to look at how we alleviate the impact of COVID-19 on people's poverty and economic inequality. So a huge amount that we've seen nationally and at local level across communities and across organisations, all things that we can build on and that will absolutely make Scotland a place that is already a good place, but so much better for all of our children over the next few years. I don't want to give anyone any concern that I'm being overly complacent on that. As we've said, the pandemic has revealed manifest inequalities. It's also highlighted in the harrowing stories in many cases of children, young people and families, the inconsistent and sometimes completely inadequate response that children and some children and young people have received, for example, in support of their learning, those who needed a multidisciplinary approach for them and their families, for example, in relation to their mental health and well-being, domestic violence, etc. It's not been good enough for many of our children, and that has to change. So that takes us, I hope, well, to say why we wanted today to be in part a celebration of how much we've achieved, and also the spirit of how much we really believe that there's so much more we can do and will do to improve really significant, long-standing and sustainable improvements in children's lives. It's a positive day today, it's a progressive day, and that's going to be characterized by later this afternoon the launch of our manifesto that's been signed up to by many, many organizations across the sector, and will unite us all, those of us all who are concerned with children and young people's lives, as we move forward into the Scottish parliamentary elections. And then in particular, really delighted that we're able to hear today from Katherine Trebeck, because it's increasingly clear that in terms of the strengths of Scotland's approach, we have a national performance framework that focuses on improving the outcomes for children's health and well-being, but we're not seeing the systemic and financial changes that are necessary to achieve that absolutely fantastic ambition. So Katherine's work, alongside the work of others, is really going to help us begin to make tangible, practical progress in relation to how we achieve a budget that's actually going to work for all of Scotland's children, young people, and in turn, therefore, the wider well-being of all of us in Scotland. So that was why I hope you've signed up to attend today, and really looking forward to the discussions. I really hope you'll feel it's been a great use of your time. When we meet again, it will be great that I really hope that you will look back on today's event as being one of the events that have really helped you sustain your optimism and energy in relation to how we can and are improving children's lives, and also how we can look back on today as being one of the events where we have absolutely achieved progress and helped set our agenda for the way forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Before introducing Katherine formally, I'm going to ask Karen from Children in Scotland's events team, who's led the organisation of today, to introduce you to the more sophisticated technological approaches to how we're going to do our best to make sure that we have a really coordinated and inclusive discussion alongside Katherine and the team who are participating and presenting on Katherine's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you. So hopefully you can all see this now. If my team can give me a wee thumbs up, if you can see that, lots of nodding heads, thank you. So what we're going to do is actually similar to what we have been doing at our annual conference for the last couple of years. So if you have been along, this should be familiar to you, or you might have done it in other webinars, because we're all having to learn how to do online evaluation now, because we don't have the happy sheets. The good news for us is that you can't then complain about the tea and coffee because you've made it yourself this morning. So what we need you to do, I'll give you a wee second, is get your phones or open a new internet window on your screen. And if you can go to www.menti.com. So I'm going to give you just a wee moment to do that. Okay, so when you get there, you should see something similar to this. You'll see similar to what's in front now. If you can type in the code, you'll see it on the screen there at the top. If you can type in the code 2803801. So if we all type that in, I'm doing it just now, so 801, and submit that. So you'll see a nice wee screen welcoming you and thanking you for joining us. Oh, good, people are starting to come in now. Great. So if you can tell us how you feel about using technology. Only one saying help, so I'm going to take that as a good thing. Oh no, two, I've jinxed it. And mainly everyone going, yeah, used to it now. Love it or hate it, we've learned to live with it. Okay, so thank you. I think we're doing good with that. So that was the easy question. So we're going to move on now, and would like you to tell us. So there's our testing from earlier. If you can tell us something that you hope to learn today. So we know Katherine and team are coming along to talk about well-being and bold budgets. So maybe something from that, or maybe there's something in the Children in Scotland manifesto that you've contributed to or you'd like to learn a little bit more about. And of course, we've got our pre-recorded content on YouTube. So when you look in your PDF program that you've received from Eventbrite or from the team, you'll be able to click the links to look on our YouTube playlist, and there's 3 different videos there, so maybe you want to learn something from there. So lots of things coming in. So we can see the main important thing for us now is that Menti is working. We're glad to see you're wanting to learn new ideas, keeps coming through. So the way the Menti works is that the more people type something in, the bigger it becomes in the word cloud. So we know that most people have said new ideas, a bit about well-being, something inspiring, and so on and so on. So throughout the day today, you'll see that we're using Menti. So for all of this morning, you'll have the same Menti code. So if you just keep your phone handy, then, or your window open if you're doing it on the desktop, then you'll be able to contribute to that as we're going through it. Okay, so we're working, we're good. I am gonna stop sharing now, and Jackie, I'm gonna hand back to you, and we're gonna get started with Katherine's session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. So good. Is that, am yes, I am on. Sorry, Karen. Thank you. Okay. I was just gazing at the Menti screen, and then it went for me. So that's fine. But I was noticing, without any pressure for Karen, how well-being and budgeting and everything is absolutely up there in terms of people's expectations. So that's no pressure on us, because that's absolutely going to be fulfilled. You've got a real treat ahead. I'm really delighted to welcome Katherine, and in terms of a personal, a high really of the last year working with Katherine and alongside Carnegie and Kathnack Trusts has been a real joy and such an amazing privilege to learn so much about how we're going to achieve, as Katherine's entitled it, a bolder budget. Because really this has been, in one way or another, dominating, I think, my professional life, and certainly time in Children in Scotland, that we really have to make significant changes. So to be able to work alongside and learn from folk who actually can help us with the answers of how we achieve that is such a privilege. So I'm very grateful to Katherine. I think probably all of you know Katherine, but perhaps just a few words to remind us of her significant experience that we're so lucky to benefit from. So obviously Katherine had over 8 years experience in senior roles with Oxfam, and then she helped establish the Wellbeing Economy Governance and Supporting Alliance. She's come to Scotland to settle, hopefully fairly permanently, at least for the foreseeable, perhaps, as she is the Honorary Professor at the University of West of Scotland, Senior Visiting Research Fellow at Strathclyde. She contributed to the Independent Care Review in terms of developing an economic model for how a lot of the recommendations and aspirations for the Independent Care Review could be achieved. And we know that that's had significant interest and hopefully more than interest from Scottish Government and COSLA. So that's really, to then have been able to secure Katherine's agreement to work with us has been absolutely fantastic. So just to say a little bit about, if you like, Katherine is doing all the work, but there is a team alongside her, and Children in Scotland has been really honoured, I think, to work with Jennifer Wallace, Head of Policy at Carnegie Trust, and Sophie Fleming, who's the Chief Executive of the Kathnack Trust. They both those forward-looking trusts that I'm sure most of you will know really, really well, came together because they also share, I think, an ambition to know that things can be different for children and know that Scotland can achieve a wellbeing budget. And they've brought a wealth of experience and knowledge with them to absolutely add a robust discussion, robust evidence base rather, to enable really informed discussion about how we can move forward. What was particularly helpful and really very humbling for us was that Children in Scotland Strategic Forum, which is the forum where 20 of our members come together to represent children in Scotland's interests. We were talking a lot about how we wanted to improve children's lives, their mental health and well-being, their learning, their rights, etc. But as all of you know, you come up time and time again against, well, how are we going to pay for it? And difficult choices are going to be made. And the forum recognized we have to have, we have to really have a robust evidence base, because we're being listened to, lots of nods acknowledging how important this is, but we're not making that fundamental change. So we need to have far more informed, robust arguments that are evidenced and can be listened to. And we were very fortunate that Carnegie and Katherine agreed to fund Katherine, and the forum agreed to essentially commission Katherine. So we will have a really robust agenda for taking forward. So that's for taking forward our demands. So this isn't going to, Katherine is working for the trusts and is working via Children's Scotland Forum, but the output of this work and the report is going to be fundamental for all of you. It's going to be our contribution to all of you about how we can achieve the transformation in our budgets that we require. Hopefully that's enough background about how come Katherine's working for us. What I just want to say is that in taking forward this event, what we're going to do is Katherine is going to speak, and we're also going to invite Jennifer Wallace from Carnegie to say a little bit about the work and her interest, and Carnegie's interest in it as well. We unfortunately haven't, if Sophie Fleming, the Chief Exec from Katherine, can't attend with us today, but Amy Baker from Katherine is able to attend and will be responding to some of the questions in Menti where she can. So it's definitely a collective effort. And in particular, really, really pleased that we have Juliet Harris alongside us, because there is no division between Juliet's work, which is taking forward the long, hard campaign that she has led in relation to incorporation of UNCRC. This work, Katherine's work, our work, will absolutely be a fantastic way of demonstrating how we implement and how we acknowledge the rights of children through Scotland's budget. So we'll say a little bit more about the running of this once Katherine has given her introduction. But essentially, we're looking for Katherine to share her thoughts so far, and then critically look at some key issues where we really are looking for your output and views as well. So we're going to have a great session. Thank you so much. And Katherine, if I could ask you to take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks everyone for being here. This is really quite an important moment in this project, because this is the first time we're really going outside the small team with some of the ideas that are emerging. So you're seeing these initial, very tentative, very penciled in rather than written in pen suggestions. And we're really, really hoping that you can share with us your reactions, your ideas, your suggestions to polish and improve them. So really grateful for your time. I hope that doesn't mean you're disappointed that it's more a working session than a one where you're hearing us just talking at you. But I think I couldn't think of a better group of people to test drive some of what's coming out of the research so far. I'm actually going to pass to Jen to tell a little bit about the background to the project and why this consortium came together, and then from there to Jules to reflect on the link between well-being and rights, and then I'll tell you a bit more detail about the project before we dive into some of the crunchier work, if that's okay. So over to you, Jen.
Great. Thank you, Katherine and Jackie, and good morning, everybody. This is actually a very special moment for me, because I started my career at Children in Scotland 20 years ago this season, this quarter. So Children in Scotland, and in particular the annual conference, is something that I've always had a soft spot for, and I have very fond memories of. And it's been great fun this morning actually watching the names come up and some of the faces come up, and many people that I've known over that period of time here today. So on a very personal note, I just want to say hello, and it's great to be here, and it's lovely to be working with so many of you again. So I've been working at the Carnegie UK Trust now for 9 years. The Trust, as Jackie introduced it, is an independent foundation. We're based in Dunfermline and Fife. And most of what we do in this field is research and policy development. So I forgive you if you haven't delved around in our back catalogue of reports around well-being. But we've been really strong supporters of the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework over that period of time. It's world leading. We've said in several of our publications that Scotland should be proud of what it's done, what it's achieved, in having outcomes and understanding where we want to go, the direction of travel that we want for our society, and not just targets and processes for public services to deliver against. So the backdrop of our interest in our work is that we think that the framework itself is brilliant, but it has a difficulty in implementation. It has a barrier and a blockage. And that barrier and blockage stops the rhetoric around love and kindness and the best place for children to live, turning into the reality when it hits some of your lives and the work that you do. And I think one of the things that I found hardest in that when looking at the outcomes and the indicators on children and young people is that they're stubborn, they don't move. So we've spent 13 years with an outcomes framework that talks about improving children's lives as the goal for us. And we've had 10 years since the Christie Commission talked about the importance of joined up working and prevention. And yet the outcomes are the same. Our children are struggling in the same way that they were when we started this journey. And for me and for Carnegie, that's not an acceptable place to be. So we have to find that blockage and unblock it and find ways to do it. And most of the people that I've spoken to in my research identify the blockage as the budget. But then we have a fundamental problem because I don't speak economics and I'm not an accountant and I don't understand how they put together a budget. So very quickly, those of us in the NGO sector come up against a barrier that we actually can't speak the language that we need to speak in order to make this change happen. And we have to find ways of overcoming that. So I was delighted when I joined the forum that Jackie mentioned, the Strategy and Policy Forum, that conversation was already happening and that conversation had found ears within Scottish Government. Of course, because of the pandemic, attention has gone elsewhere, and we understand that, but we didn't want to lose another year in the conversation because the key civil servants had their eyes on other more pressing matters. We wanted to keep that pressure up. And so we came up with the idea of getting more evidence and perhaps finding a way of linking the language of the finance department with the language that we're more familiar with to try to unblock it. And we were just so delighted when the consortium came together. So Children in Scotland, Carnegie, Katherine and Sophie in particular have been a real supporter of this work, and then able to convince Katherine to give us the wealth of her experience and intellect and also her humanity to this project. So that's the background. That's all I wanted to say. I hope you enjoy her intervention. I hope you have a really successful time engaging with what some of these issues are and how we can break through those barriers together. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. And Juliet, over to you to reflect on rights and well-being.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm so excited to see so many faces joining an event to talk about budgeting, because I share everything that's been said before about how fundamental it is to improve well-being, to improve realisation of children's rights through the budget. So it's brilliant to see so many people here and so many people interested in this subject. So I've been asked to reflect on why the timing for Catherine's work is so perfect, and also to talk, as Jackie said, about rights and well-being. And I'd really like to echo what's already been said so far, that rights and well-being, they're not just linked, they're absolutely fundamental to each other. If you ensure the rights of children and of their families, then their well-being will improve. In fact, I think the only way we can improve the well-being of children and their families is to make sure that their rights are respected, and their rights to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to an adequate standard of living, and the right to food, which everyone's been talking so much about recently, the right to housing, the right to be listened to, the right to social security. All of this is about securing the well-being of people in Scotland. So that means that the timing for this work is absolutely perfect, because as you all probably know, there's currently a bill in the Scottish Parliament. It's actually being discussed right now by the committee. And this bill will make children's rights binding in law. But why is this bill important? What difference will it actually make? To date, then, children's rights have only really been guiding on governments. They're something that governments, local authorities, public bodies have had to think about, but not really do. And well, we all know there has been huge progress to embed rights-based approaches across Scotland. I think we all recognise that we should be doing more. We must do more. So the Uncrc Incorporation bill has actually got support from across all parties in the Scottish Parliament. And it should be passed, fingers crossed, by March next year and become law soon after. And this bill will make children's rights binding on all levels of government. It means that children's rights will have to be at the centre of everything that we do. So this is from education, health, social work, through to transport, policing, the environment, everything. And it means that rights are not just something that we'll need to think about, but something that we have to embed. And so I think in this way, the bill will provide a real step forward in securing a wellbeing economy. And excitingly, the bill includes provisions on child rights budgeting. It includes what's known as a children's scheme. And I know that sounds quite geeky and quite techy, but it does actually provide a really powerful tool to influence what steps the Scottish Government takes to embed children's rights into budgeting. And because through this children's scheme, Scottish Government is actually going to have to report on what they've done and also what they plan to do to consider children's rights in the budget process. And they're also going to have to consider what the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has said about children's rights budgeting through its recommendations and through its general comments. And really that kind of takes me back a little bit to see, what actually is a rights-based approach to budgeting and how does it contribute to a wellbeing economy. As you'll all know, the UNCRC sets out 42 substantive rights for children and young people, and many of these rights are actually realised through their families. And so it puts an obligation on government, all levels of government, to secure an adequate standard of living, the highest attainable standard of health, the right to education, to food, to social security, or more. And really, in the most simple terms, the test of whether these rights are being met is whether children and their families can live in dignity. And when I think of dignity, I always think of a Children's Parliaments project where they invented a dignometer. It was a bit like kind of forecasting, a bit like a barometer, but rather than forecasting the weather, it actually forecasts the impact that something will have on children's sense of dignity. And children from the Children's Parliament use the dignometer to identify things that have a positive impact on their feelings of dignity. So these are things like having a voice, being listened to, being protected, being cared for, having shelter, feeling safe, getting extra help when they need it, and even people saying that you're good at doing your hobbies. But children from the Children's Parliament also use the dignometer to identify things that have a negative impact on their feelings of dignity. So things like feeling cold and hungry, things like being discriminated against, being poor, being homeless, people ignoring your ideas. And so the dignometer really, it helps to forecast whether or not the rights of children and their families are being met. And in this way, it's a really good way of demonstrating the principles of children's rights budgeting. And perhaps it could even be a test as to whether or not we're achieving a wellbeing economy. The guidance that come from the UN committee on the principles of children's rights budgeting are maybe a little bit more complex than the dignometer, but they really achieve the same result. So the UN committee's guidance on child rights budgeting, and remember, Scottish Government have to look at these principles when they're budgeting once the Uncrc Incorporation bill is passed, include things like planning well. So the UN committee, in fact, I'll put this into the chat. These are the UN principles on children's rights budgeting. So it includes things like planning well, so making sure that you have the information and data that you need to know when the rights of children and their families are being met or when they're not being met. So this is really knowing which families are able to live in dignity and which ones aren't, and using this information to identify where spending needs to go to make sure that everybody can live in dignity. The principles also include the importance of participation, of involving children and their families, because you need to give children and their families the dignity of sharing their views and experiences if you know how you're going to budget, and if you're going to budget wisely and effectively. The principles also emphasise the importance of including children with additional support needs. They're really clear that to ensure equality, you might actually need to spend more money on ensuring the rights of some children than you do on the others. So it's about investing in children and investing in families. And finally, the UN principles remind us that investing in children has to be seen as a long-term investment, and investing in families is a really important way of securing children's rights. So in this way, the forthcoming incorporation of the Uncrc, making children's rights binding in law, gives us this really powerful tool to make sure that the rights of children and their families are respected and fulfilled. And so in a nutshell, along Katherine's work, coupled with Uncrc incorporation and child rights budgeting, we have everything that we need to really take huge steps forward to create a wellbeing economy that ensures the dignity of children and their families right across Scotland. And so that's why rights and wellbeing are absolutely fundamental to each other. And child rights budgeting is the way that you achieve the wellbeing economy. And I'm really excited to learn more about Katherine's work today. So thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Just brilliant, and just wonderful to see these two agendas that are so mutually reinforcing just laid out there how they're intertwined so wonderfully. So just before we get you all to do a little bit of work and share us your views, I'll tell you a bit more about the practicalities of this project. So I started back in summer, and I'm very grateful to the commissioners who have been very patient with me in that I'm not able to give this project, sadly, the 120% attention that it deserves due to other commitments. And so the timeline is quite long. So what we're looking to do is publish a fairly short interim report in the next week or so, of which will benefit from your views that you share with us today. That will be nine or so pages-ish. And it will really just be floating some of the very tentative ideas, as I said, penciled in, that I've been able to gather, working with Amy, doing a lot of desktop research, a lot of reading of reports, a lot of reading of literature, journal articles, government documents, government budget statements, a lot of other commissions and inquiries that have happened here and in other governments around the world, reading a lot of OECD material, plus well over 30 interviews with a lot of different people over the last few months, folks who are really deep in the heart of various aspects of budgeting or children's rights and children's well-being, structural issues, really trying to harness all that wisdom. But one of the things that I'm very aware of is that this is a small project given the magnitude of what we're trying to answer here. And so we're hoping this will be something that moves the debate along. It certainly won't be the final word. It won't put the lid on the issue. It won't be the perfect set of recommendations. Hopefully it will open up more conversations and move to greater appetite to engage in the sort of changes that are required. So it's tentative. Hopefully it's contributing, but definitely not the definitive piece. And really aware that there are so many more people in an ideal world I would love to speak to, who have got expertise, who have got insight, who have got wisdom, and just because of resources aren't able to do that. And so hence why today is so important and so wonderful as a moment where you can share your views, but you'll also be able to share your thoughts on that interim report that will be circulating in the next couple of weeks. So don't feel that at all that today is the only opportunity. Do feel that this is a project that you can speak to and input into, and offer your suggestions and ways we can improve what we're coming up with. So there's the interim report, as I've said, over the next few weeks, and then we're looking at probably late March for a more fulsome report, all things going well. what I want to do today is two rounds of feedback, 2 rounds of diving into Menti, offering your views. And the first round is going to look at what I'm calling the fundamentals of a wellbeing budget. This is really what's been bubbling up through all the reading and the conversations I've been having about really, if we're serious about having a budget that supports children's wellbeing in Scotland, what are some of the key principles that needs to take account of and needs to be governed by and needs to incorporate? And so if you can, Karen, just put that list on the screen, that will be brilliant. And I'll talk you through them. And then after we've had a feedback on those, we'll dive into some of the changes and the granularity of, I guess, the structural changes that are going to happen in terms of the budget. So this is the first round, looking at the fundamentals of a wellbeing budget. And Karen, if you can just flick up that, put the list up in whole. And so we're going to offer you in a moment a chance to say, is there anything missing, and just reflect on some of those fundamentals. But very, very briefly, this point, the top point there about it being relationship focused, this is really just saying children, of course, matter as individuals, but they don't exist in bubbles. They exist in families, that exist in communities, that exist in labour markets, are influenced by the macroeconomy. And if we're really going to attend to their well-being, we need to understand and support that web of relationships that influence children's well-being in all sorts of different ways, and really support attending to those needs and the circumstances that enable children to thrive. The second one around being outcomes orientated. This is shift that's happening in quite a few budgets to thinking, what is it we're really wanting to deliver? So the main game is not what's the service or how much money is being spent, but it is what is actually happening, moving towards really assessing the impact and the change that's being delivered. And there's some different ways of doing this through different performance management and priority setting that I'll come back to later. It's also, as we've just heard so brilliantly from Jules, about ensuring that the budget is rights-based. Things like using the resources to have maximum impact, progressive realization of human rights, and perhaps really most excitingly, I think, this role of the participation of children and their families in the budget process. It's also about shifting the budget mentality from just being something that happens every year to an annual cycle, beyond an annual cycle, to something that's much more long-term, but also is about upstream attention as well. So not just about trying to help people survive and cope with current circumstances, but really looking at what are the wider causes, what's at the root of some of the challenges that families and then hence children are facing, and how can we attend to them. This is about really looking beyond the intervening, as so often emerges in the literature, intervening in a family, but really understanding why is harm and challenge being created in the first place. And this is a question around social, structural, economic questions as well. And very related to that is this idea of the budget having a preventative focus. I mean, prevention is a term that it is constantly heard in Scotland. And as Jen mentioned, particularly since the Christie Commission, we talk a lot about focusing on prevention in Scotland, but we're not actually that good at it. It's much easier to support someone who's in desperate need than to stop that need arising in the first place. That's a very, very different conversation, different way of working. And the budget has to enable moving from downstream intervention to really preventing harm being done. This is about going from really to really primary prevention rather than tertiary prevention, as is talked about. When I say the word precautionary, this is also linked to the longer term focused and understanding those web of relationships. This is about recognizing that there is a lot of very, very sound evidence about the merits and of supporting children in their families right now, and also the long-term benefits that will bring about. But the challenge comes is when we seek a definitive red line between intervening or pulling one lever here and outcomes perhaps 10 years down the track. There's lots of sound evidence, but it's perhaps not very, very specific. And so what we need to do is adapt what I'm calling a precautionary principle that comes from sustainable development literature, that is saying we know enough to have a theory of change, to understand the sort of activities and shifts we need to undertake now. And so that's quite a different mindset from how we assess projects, how we test policies, how we analyze impact. But I think it's important if we're going to really be able to take that long-term perspective that's required. And finally, and to me, this is one I'm really excited about, is, you know, much more participatory, really opening up the budget process at all different stages to not just the voices of stakeholders that are used to responding to calls for evidence and giving contributions to parliamentary committees, but having children and their families as part of the budget process, taking account of their views and their ideas into the budget process. How are we going to do that is something I'd really welcome your suggestions on in the coming weeks. So please don't hold back in sharing suggestions practically how we can make that happen. So that's what's emerging. Karen, I'm going to pass to you now for the mentee aspect of this fundamentals round.
Okay, so as we move on, we've got our first question, and you can see, Catherine, I don't know if you'd clocked that, in the bottom corner is the little love button.
Oh.
So everybody that's agreeing or likes what's on the slide is able to click on that. So I'm sure now that I've mentioned it, yep, it's going to start going up and up. So that's lovely. So we'll let that go, just to give you a bit of love for a wee moment of what you've said. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to your questions. So first question we've had some people clicked ahead and done it already, so that's great. So what other fundamentals would you add to the list that we've just seen before that Catherine's just run through? And again, we know the bigger the words are, the more people are typing them in. So we'll give you a wee minute to do that.
Do you know, while that's coming in, if I may just comment on it, great to see the word sustainable, because I skipped over an aspect around the preventative aspect, which of course is for future generations, really recognizing the impact on well-being in current and future generations. So just to reassure folks, it's in there. And that's nice to have that endorsement for that aspect too.
And I'm really pleased. I think, yes, holistic is coming in and out, but that holistic approach, it's interesting, isn't it, that whether or not, I think, Catherine, do we need that specifically, or should it almost be implicit and underpinning the other fundamentals? I think that's definitely something to reflect on, isn't it?
Absolutely. And yes, it's holistic beyond the perspective of relationships and long-term and upstream. I mean, it's a great word that we should use.
Yeah. Collaborative, I think, as well. I think that because I think it's going to be interesting, isn't it, the extent to which the more participation there is, quite rightly, of children and families, the role of the practitioners, the policymakers alongside them, will they feel part of this, or is it going to be a little bit uncomfortable, really, in relation to some of the power dynamics and the role of the children's sector, of government policy, etc.? I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic that we need to attend to.
And I think some will feel a little bit nervous about the changes that we're suggesting. I think some will be excited by them. I think some will be willing, but perhaps not feeling prepared. And so something we'll come back to is the skills and ways of working for civil servants to be able to embrace some of these suggestions.
Yes.
Jen, Juliet, yeah.
If I go first, I'm really interested to see values-based coming out, and I think there's something really really helpful in the way that Scotland is having a much more open conversation about what our values are as people, and sometimes that's using words like kindness and love, but also in there are values of equality, and I think we need, we can find a way to get that shift in as well. Would be really, really helpful.
I was just wanting to have a little look, because I think there's some additional comments coming through on the chat, and yeah, I think Martin Dorchester's from Includum's just come in terms of language, and the point about institutional, that language is going to be a barrier and a precursor to effective participation, which is, again, I think probably echoes to Juliet's point that we're doing an awful lot, but there's, you know, what was it? I love it. Is it dignometer? Digniometer? I mean, that's kind of such a great example of, come on now, we can make these really sort of perhaps overly academic to some, you know, principles absolutely real and based on, and I wondered how we can do more of that, perhaps, Juliet, in the wider sort of participation ambitions we have for this work and others.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. The dignometer I absolutely adore, because it makes things so simple. It shows that, yes, okay, rights are there in, you know, in complicated laws, and it's all about the UN, but actually, particularly when we talk about being values driven, rights are also something that you feel, and people intrinsically know when their rights have been infringed because it impacts on their dignity. And so I completely agree with Martin's point about language. And I think the way that we do that is actually having tools to involve children and young people in child rights budgeting that they invent, because they invented the dignometer. And it's just the best tool for looking at the impact on how rights are affected by different decisions. I put a link into chat so that people can have a look at the dignometer, because it is fantastic.
Thanks very much. And a couple of other supporting comments coming via the chat as well around really the importance of paying attention, and the whole system paying attention to consistent language. Education is mentioned by one of the participants. I wonder, and yes, others coming through as well. And just a final thought from me, I think another aspect that plays to a certain unease around some of the well-being concept is that clearly mental health here has is prominent among the fundamentals that people have contributed. And I think you know, I think we probably, I wonder whether or not well-being is seen by some as possibly being a warmer term that avoids some of the really serious issues around mental health that we're seeing that children, young people and their families are facing in terms of, you know, obviously the impact in relation to their economic inequality, social deprivation, etc. So I wonder if we need to be, I don't know what others think about that, but I think that was interesting that is very strong there.
Yes, and I think with well-being and mental health is a good example of the need to strike the right balance between sort of supporting people cope with current acute moments of mental ill health, but also taking the time to understand why families and individuals are feeling stress and anxiety that's exacerbating their mental health challenges, and really looked upstream as well. And Jen's heard me say this a lot. I often talk about the 2 SCs of well-being, and the first SC is survival and coping, and of course that's vital, that's a humanitarian response. But then the other SC is system change, and I think that really looks upstream and looks at the root causes. And I think a good well-being budget is one that attends to both, because they're both vital. I think I'd love to pass to Karen for the folks to go beyond one word and just offer a few reflections. So Karen, over to you for the next question.
We'll move on, and I think I'm going to just go backwards just for one moment, if I may. Just oops, a little bit too far. Just to remind you before we move on to the next question, I think it would be handy just to do a wee reminder of the fundamentals that Katherine spoke about before. So you can see them there, if you can keep them in mind. Oh, we've got more love coming in the corner, so that's nice. So if you just a little refresher on them, and we'll just skip through all these answers that we've had there. Just to say as well, somebody's mentioned it's a little bit tricky sometimes to read the word cloud when it comes in. So sorry if that's a little bit awkward for some of you, but we definitely will forward this on and we'll share this afterwards. So you've got a little bit more time to read through it. And so the next question was said, and great, some answers already. Please tell us more what you think about the different fundamentals, and please make it clear if you're expanding on a point a little bit, what exactly it is you're talking about, what fundamental that we've mentioned previously, or something else that's maybe come to mind. If you could make it clear what you're mentioning, and we'll give you a couple of minutes, and I shall hand back to Catherine, Jackie, Jules, if there's anything else you want to add while these are coming in.
I'll just say this bit is for folks to just reflect a little bit more on their words of anything we may have missed, or any of the particular aspects we're already suggesting. Is there anything, other detail you'd suggest we add and take account of? And we'll spend a couple of minutes and then we'll move to the next round around the necessities. Amy, how are you going with, are there any questions that are coming up? Everyone's focused on their mentee. That's brilliant.
That's worth mentioning though, actually, Catherine, that if you do have any questions that you think maybe don't sit quite right with the mentee or things that we're talking about at the time, if you put anything you're thinking about into the chat, then we'll pick the questions up, and not even necessarily questions, thoughts and comments about anything that we're talking about or you think would be useful for Catherine and the team to cover or to think about more. So please feel free to use the chat and we will pick it up as we go through.
Is it possible to scroll the screen so that we can see what else has been written? Thank you.
We wanted it to be going automatically there. I was beavering away trying to make it go automatically, but I will go old school and I will use my mouse and I'll scroll down slowly and let you see them.
Just to reflect, when you're saying bits you like as well, that's really, really helpful, because in the process of refining a report, there'll be questions and bits I might need to cut out. So knowing what to underline and absolutely keep in too is, having that endorsement is so helpful too. Karen, you just say when you feel folks it's starting to wind up, or if things are still coming in.
Still a little bit of typing going on, so what I'll do is I'll scroll down to the bottom, and then I think by the time I get there we can maybe move on, if that sounds okay.
I think this is really showing, isn't it? The using this technology, and what's that? I think 56 contributions already, and giving lots of endorsements and validation to what Catherine has already set out, but equally a real steer in terms of areas we need to focus on. I just don't think we'd have had this this richness and amount, in a more traditional workshop. So thanks so much for using this, folks. Thank you.
And I think we're at the bottom of our list now.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for that round, and we'll be harvesting that and going through it gleefully in the coming days and weeks. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move to the next section, which is really, if we're taking those fundamentals seriously, what in practical sense needs to change in how the budget process operates. So we're calling these the necessary changes section. So Karen, if you're able just to flick onto the list there of necessary changes. And again, these, you can imagine in the longer report in March will probably be quite chunky pieces of writing. Yeah, that's smoke alarm. I think that's a car alarm outside my my window here. Apologies for that. It's all this action in Hindland. I hope you can hear over me. I'll try and keep it keep it safe. Thank you for your concern. So in terms of these necessary changes in the actual report, these will be probably quite substantial pieces of writing and description. So what you'll hear now is very, very brief, almost bullet points under some of these changes. But these, again, are what's emerging in the research that Amy and I have been doing so far about what are the crunchy aspects of how we go about moving the budget process. I'll also share with you one of the things I'm struggling with in this research is that there's a lot of statements and policies about what the government does do in terms of assessment and focusing on well-being and connecting the budget to other higher order goals. What I'm struggling with is actually seeing evidence of that in practice. And it'd be interesting to see whether, and some of the questions we'll dive into that, whether that's also something that folks experience, that there's some good ideas and good policy statements, but not yet being embedded into ways of working and budget processes. So that's something it feels like a bit of a black box, understanding how the budget process works. So it's something I've been struggling with in this research to date. That car alarm, I hope, has just gone off now. It's very, very annoying. So it's really loud, isn't it? I'm really sorry. What a nightmare. I'm up on the 4th floor as well, so you can imagine how loud it is down at street level. Right, I'm going to pretend it's not happening and just talk through these bullet points. So in terms of new conversations within and around the budget process, there's 2 aspects of this. One is general public awareness raising, having a conversation across Scotland around trying to build the political support, the public demand, the awareness around the importance of looking upstream, the importance of paying attention to root causes. And the fact now that so many of our political debates around election time are how many police are government's going to promise, how many nurses, those sorts of questions, rather than are people being kept safe and healthy in their communities, I think shows that we do need a conversation in Scotland about really being serious about the root causes and understanding impact. So that's something there. I think there needs to be a much wider conversation. And then the other aspect to that is within the budget process, and this speaks very much to the question of participation across the budget process. How do we ensure children's voices and those of their families are heard, listened to and attended to? So questions around appropriate resources, understandable information, different mechanisms, creative spaces being opened up, having things like maybe a dignometer. Those sorts of questions really have to be thought open-mindedly embraced. And so I'd love your ideas about how to do that practically as well. And mechanisms that we think the Scottish government would be willing to take up. So that's new conversations around and within the budget. The next one is around the goal and the vision statement. And this is something that Jen's already mentioned, that we are fairly blessed in Scotland to have the National Performance Framework. It's often cited by other governments around the world as being world leading. But we've also got the child poverty targets as well that put some pretty firm targets into the sort of outcomes we need to see in terms of reductions to child poverty. How can we take those as, and forgive me for this horrible American jargon, but the North Star that we're really wanting policy and budget to lead towards, welcoming the fact that the National Performance Framework and the child poverty targets are in existence. How can we use them then to map how are we performing? Can we create a well-being map that shows things like distributional analysis of where across some of the dimensions of the National Performance Framework and child poverty targets, people are falling below? And so that we use them then to inform the budget so that it directly speaks to how we need to reallocate funding accordingly. For the next one, and this is fairly chunky piece around the budget mechanisms themselves. And as I've said, I am finding the budget process a little bit of a black box. It's quite hard to understand in detail the sequence of how things operate. But what I'm wanting is for us to have a children's wellbeing impact assessment that learns from the distributional mapping that's based on the National Performance Framework and the child poverty targets. And then really the next stage will be to assess the budget mechanisms and the policies that they speak to for, are they preventing harm? You know, really asking these questions, and are they creating a context that's enabling children and their families to thrive, and use that lens to scrutinize budget policy making. And I'm going to come to this later, we'll need a dedicated office with the skill sets and the analysis to be able to do that. And of course, that has to include children's views in that. We also should be then assessing what comes out of the budget process and policies against those goals. And it's essentially looking at how is the budget creating costs and creating benefits. And this is one of the key things over a 10-year time frame. And this means changing the way we see budgets to not just big annual moments, but actually seeing them as milestones towards 10-year goals. And budgets actually as an opportunity to tweak and recalibrate, but seeing them as inputs to a much bigger package that's encapsulated by the National Performance Framework and the child poverty targets. And that's quite a profound shift. Budgets are often fairly self-contained annual moments, but actually saying, almost downplaying them as ingredients to a bigger goal, if that makes sense. And part of that is assessing the policies, the suggested policies that are floated in the program for government, and then the budgets that underpin them, assess them for their robustness in terms of how they support children's wellbeing. Again, that's a very different lens, but needs to be run across the budget process. As you can imagine, there's a lot of detail here that's not really easy to share on Menti, but you'll see it when it comes from the interim report, and then much more fleshed out in the final report. And so essentially, this is that idea of using the children's wellbeing impact assessment to divvy up much longer term allocations of resources, not services that's going to be delivered for 1 year and then have to go and ask for more money. Really having long-term programs of resource and effort that attend to these root causes. And again, I'll say it again, just seeing the annual budgets as opportunities to refine and adjust rather than moments in and of themselves. And something that's emerged a lot is we already do this in Scotland with the capital budget. We spend long periods of time when we're building a bridge or a new road or something. And we have, long-term goals. They span many political cycles. They take into account some uncertainty. Why can't we do that when it comes to investing in our children and our families? So taking some of the mindset that already exists in how we spend capital budget spending. The next, and I'll really forgive me for racing through this, but there's a lot to get through in a short period of time. But again, please don't feel this is the only time to input. The next one is old money and new money. And again, there's a real tension here because acute needs are so profound. So how do we go about not turning off the tap or flicking a light switch, but how do we go about starting to invest much more in attending to the root causes, while also recognize that we need to help people survive and cope with current circumstances? So what we're looking at here is perhaps new ring-fenced additional money that can really focus upstream on the family support and what's necessary. And perhaps the promise fund that's come out from the care review is something that we can utilise there. But I also want to say, we shouldn't be shying away from raising the taxes that are necessary to support our children to live a life that they want to improve their well-being. I mean, even just in the last few months of the COVID-19 crisis, where budgets are apparently constrained, there'll be a lot of businesses and a lot of families who have seen their wealth increase. We've seen house prices increase, for example. And so we need to have that conversation in Scotland about taxing wealth more progressively. We need to have conversation about maybe do we levy a one-off charge on in industries that do very well out of failure demand, a term that was floated in the Christie Commission. So we need to have that and be ready for that discussion in Scotland as well. And often I've been told in my conversations, some of these things are just political hot potatoes, so you can't go there, Catherine. but I think we need to go there. I'm going to keep going into the next point around departmental changes. What we're talking about here requires a lot of shifts around how people working in the civil service operate. They're going to need new skills, new incentive structures, permission to work with other teams in other departments. Perhaps they should be rewarded when they team up with another department and pool their budget by perhaps additional money for pooled budgets that incentivizes teams working together. They're going to need new heuristics, new ways of thinking to go upstream and to undertake that analysis from the precautionary perspective rather than seeking definitive, perfect analysis that perhaps they've been trained into thinking and expecting. So that's really important, and all the support that's going to require. So linked to that is this second to last point around leadership and support. What I'm thinking is that we're really going to have a focal entity to mobilize government staff, to drive implementation, to feed in the stakeholder views, to make sure families and children are having their voices heard, and feedback mechanisms to say, here's what we heard and here's how we responded accordingly. And also to ensure continuity of effort beyond one political cycle or one political leader, to keep this as a consistent, this is how we do things in Scotland. And so what I'm coming down to thinking is that we need really a politically neutral but dedicated unit or office or team of people, and I haven't come up with a zingy name yet, so I'd love your ideas, to be a critical friend, to be independent, but also deep within budget processes, to scrutinise, to do these wellbeing impact assessments, to do that wellbeing mapping, have a formally recognised role within the budget process, but also be separate enough to be very critical. I'd envisage them working fairly closely with Audit Scotland to make sure that the audit processes are aligned and supportive. And it could, I think, potentially build on one of the existing groups that are already in operation, perhaps give them more teeth, give them more statutory role, give them more resources. So perhaps it could be the Budget Equality Advisory Group, it could be the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership, it could be the Children's Commissioner, could be even the First Minister's Council or Advisory Council on Women's and Girls. In a way, I'm a bit agnostic, and I'd love your ideas. There are these groups in existence. We may not need to create another one. So I'd love thoughts and ideas about how we take those and create this focused, dedicated unit. And hands up, this is completely inspired by the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, who has a team of amazing officers with her, and her job is to scrutinise budgets according to how preventative they are, to scrutinise policy in terms of how upstream it looks and whether it attends to the well-being of current and future generations. And she also looks across all 44 Welsh public officers to make sure that their work, their plans are aligned with what we needed. So completely inspired by what our friends in Wales are doing, and really trying to think about how can we replicate that in Scotland, but recognising that there are existing bodies as well. Finally, and then I'm going to turn it to you back to you, Karen, for some mentee action, is structural shifts beyond the budget. And this is something that's really has come up again and again in the research and exploring and reading and conversations I've had thus far, is that the budget is not and cannot be the be all and end all. That yes, how we spend our money is important, but also things like regulations and how we implement legislation is so vital in Scotland in terms of how are we addressing imbalances of power? Are we pre-distributing money and wealth rather than just redistributing it and using services to attend to failures in outcomes? Are we looking at things like democracy, stigma, procurement, employment laws, those sorts of questions? And so my final sense is that this has to be beyond just outcomes budgeting. It has to be about systems change governing across the whole piece of policy making and governance in Scotland as well. I'm going to stop there and pass to Karen, because it's a little bit more complicated what we're asking you to do. There's a few more junctures in this mentee sessions, but you're in Karen's capable hands. And any questions, put them in the chat and we'll come to them as well.
There's quite a bit coming in actually, Catherine, which has been nice to see. So I just moved these on. So I don't know, do you want to talk through these before we move on to getting people to actually do their answer?
Sure. So this first one really speaks to something I was saying at the beginning there, that I have found it a struggle. While I've been reading a lot of good statements from government, we do this and we connect this and there's a wellbeing impact assessments, I'm struggling to see evidence of that. And so this is really about asking you to help me understand a bit more what really is happening in practice. Is it just that there's rhetoric and not yet the practice changes? And so these are the questions around how effective is the budget in supporting wellbeing? Does this and the outcomes set in the MPF, is the MPF a useful vision? Jen's talked about it being world leading. Are we fairly content with it at the moment? And particularly I'm envisaging really building in the child poverty targets as well. And then we're going to finish with a question to ask you to share any other suggestions. And we will of course harvest what you're already suggesting in the Zoom chat now. So we'll go through those questions one at a time now. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, so we've had some people already answering, so that's great. So this is a little bit different to the word cloud. What you'll see is each of the 4 separate questions as I run down on there. Hopefully you see that highlighted. As you move along, as you move your arrow along, you'll see that it moves from, I don't know what this is, because we felt we had to recognise that for some people this is completely new. So if you don't know what that is, absolutely fine. You can tell us that, and that in itself is useful information. All the way up to, I know about this, it's working brilliantly. And as your mouse or your finger along the slider on your phone, you'll see that there's little increments along there. So I'll give you a wee minute to go through there. And please excuse me, a couple of people have messaged me asking about the halo that I have above my head. I can't, no matter what I do with the screen or where I move, it's there. So people who know me will know that this follows me about in life wherever I go. Okay, so a few coming in. I can see that we've still got a few people that have not answered. So please don't feel that if you don't know, not that you don't want to answer. It's also, from speaking to Catherine, really helpful for her and for the team to know if you don't know what it is and you're not sure about it, because that's helpful in terms of what could be communicated and how it can be communicated.
Very, very much so, yes. So knowing that an audience like this, that the National Performance Framework hasn't seeped into your work, is very telling and extraordinarily useful to know.
So your options, just, we'll give it another 30 seconds, but just your options, in case you weren't sure, were number 1 was, I don't know what this is. Number 2 was, I've heard of this, but I'm not too sure about it. Number 3, I know that processes exist, but they're not really being used. Number 4, this is good, working effectively. And number 5, this is working brilliantly. So I think we've got a good number come in now, Catherine. So I think that's some pretty clear answers that are coming through.
That's very clear, and as you said, Catherine, rather so helpful in terms of the honesty and the demonstration of how collectively we need to move forward, and also, it says something, doesn't it, about where Scotland is in comparison to the rhetoric that you've swayed, you've that point that you've made so powerfully, Catherine.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, folks, for your openness. Really helpful. Should we move to the next one, Karen? So this is Karen just sharing what's already written in the National Performance Framework, and it's got various different layers, and these are the top level purpose, if you like, underpin that, or various outcomes and a whole lot of targets. So there's a lot more we could have shown you. Didn't want to have loads and loads and loads of slides, but it's really grateful. I'm very grateful for people putting up the link in the chat. But at the most high level, this is what the National Performance Framework sets out as the purpose. And so our next question is, really, how do you feel about that? You know, does this describe Scotland that's the best country to grow up in? Sorry, Karen, explain the process here a bit more.
Sorry if I clicked on before you're finished.
No, go ahead.
Too excited.
No, go ahead. I'm happy for you to explain the question now.
Yeah, so this is just a straightforward, tell us where you are with it, what do you think of it? If you're not sure about it or you've not heard about it before today, so you don't feel you can comment on the content too much, then that's option one, you're unsure. If you think it's looking okay, but maybe needs a bit more work to be aligned with children's wellbeing, and that kind of resonates with some of what's coming in through the chat, that's the middle option. Or if you're familiar with it and you think it's pretty good, that's a good vision for Scotland, then that's your third option there. So we've got a don't know or unsure, needs a bit of work, or yeah, this is good. So we're just about up there with the number of responses we've had for most of the questions. Catherine, maybe another couple coming in. Yeah, I think
that's
we're good.
Great, because then we've got one more question where people get to offer general suggestions, which I'm really excited about.
A couple of sneaky ones coming in the end there, so we're going to move on now. I think every time I say that, another couple come in, but we'll move on now.
Brilliant.
So, just asking for any more suggestions for our children's wellbeing budget. So this is your chance really just to a bit of freehand if there's anything you want added in there. And we should say we'll be lifting, or as Catherine says, harvesting, I like that, quite autumnal phrase. We'll be taking everything that you contribute, whether you put it into the chat or whether you put it into the Menti, we'll collate it all. So all of your thoughts and comments will contribute whichever way you put it in. And similarly, if you have any thoughts afterwards or later on, then we'll be sharing later on how you can share that with us as well.
Amy, while those responses are coming through, are there any questions in the chat that we should just speak to?
I think at the moment there's a lot of really helpful suggestions and a couple of questions, but they've been very kindly answered by other people in the chat. So at the moment, I think we're okay.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for keeping an eye on that.
I think that's helpful there, that as Karen's scrolling through the impact on the children's sector around the local budgets, health and social care partnerships, etc. I think that's really something that we need to make sure comes through the work. Catherine, as you said, it's about that whole system budgeting and that line of sight from national through to local, community level, etc. And the process that needs to apply to all is critical. So thank you very much for that reminder to make sure that we're explicit there.
Catherine, we've just had a question from Susan Murray, and she's asked if you could say a bit more about old and new money.
Sure. So this is something around really trying to balance the acute needs now that, I mean, with COVID, have even got more acute, with the need to at the same time spend on upstream investment type activities, and rather than seeing it as a light switch where you can just automatically quickly shift to one, looking for an additional pot of money to really pump prime some of that change so we don't need to turn off the tap instantly. The hope would be that in time, the better Scotland gets at this sort of work, we might be able to reduce not all acute needs, but perhaps some of the avoidable ones that are driven by, for example, poverty and inequality. If we can reduce those, then ultimately we could free up money perhaps for other sources of income. But it's very much about a slow incremental migration rather than a light switch. So that's partly hence why we're saying we need a new pot of money, and maybe we could start to envisage the Promise Fund as playing a role to some extent in that. But in addition, again, as I said, I don't think Scotland should shy away from conversations about raising money. Scotland is still a profoundly wealthy, very wealthy country, and there is money and resources out there. And I think we need to, if we're serious about it being the best country to grow up in, not only do we need to find some of that money and invest it in the support that's needed, but also recognize that those extreme levels of wealth in and of themselves exacerbate economic inequality that do harm to children as well. Jen, I'm also going to, if it's okay, ask you to come in around one of your questions around your now and the urgency of this right now. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Jen.
My internet is unstable, and I missed the introduction to that, but I think I can guess. I think so. One of the things that I observed is that we've had prevention funds before as a country, but they're not really tied into that kind of long-term planning that you're describing. So the prevention fund happens and then stops, but there's no system change. So it's not part of, how do we go from 10 years of, all being crisis and acute to a more preventative system. It's a one-off intervention. And I think that's where we need to really work smarter to make sure that if we are successful in getting those additional funds, the system change funds, they're really transformative rather than just being in and of themselves. I think all of those funds, the ones that I know of, really did want to do that. And I think maybe that comes back to your question of, well, where does the scrutiny come in? Where does the power come into this to actually make it happen? And perhaps somebody like a Future Generations Commissioner or additional roles for existing commissioners might be the way to make sure that that pressure is kept up as people, go through the process of a 3-year fund and at the end of it have perhaps lost a little bit of the love that they had from the outset.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Catherine, I wonder, obviously the ideas are still coming through, but very conscious of time, and I'm keen that we have at least 5 minutes or so to invite particular contributions from people around the advocacy for this work, how we're going to make sure it's listened to, paid attention to and acted on, and we really need people's views on that. So Karen, while you're still scrolling, could I just remind people about the process that firstly, this whole session is being recorded, so nobody will lose the information that will be harvested from this. So everybody will have a record. Catherine's interim report will be issued over the next few weeks, and there will be a specific link to how people can comment on that, and we will gather that and make sure that that feeds into the final report, and with a view to that being published by the end of March. But we'll also obviously look at making sure that we can do some work to disseminate the emerging key conclusions from the final report over the first quarter of 2021. We haven't quite worked through that yet, but we want you to feel really well aware and informed and alert to the work as it emerges and once it's published. So any questions, then get back to me or any of us in Children's Scotland. We will make sure we can put you in touch with the wider team on this. And keep you up to date with that. Catherine, I think, again, in terms of, I think if I could invite you, Jen or Juliet, to make any just very brief reflective comments, and then just to alert participants, we're going to take a final few minutes to hear directly from you about specific ideas, if you can. Put them in the chat, but it'd be lovely to get some more voices to tell us, right, here's the idea for making sure that report really hits who it needs to hit and get taken forward. So just to give you a few minutes to prepare for that. And Catherine, Jen and Juliet, any very brief closing comments?
My final comment is just one of enormous gratitude to everyone on this call for your ideas. I'm excited to see them. I haven't been able to follow every single one. I think that's been scrolling too quickly, but really looking forward to reviewing them and incorporating them, and really, yeah, making the most of all your wisdom that you've been so generous to share. So for me, it's a thank you. It's also a sense that of just how important this piece of work is, and just how great it is that we're doing this now in Scotland, and that Scotland's a place where we can at least be hopeful that we can open up these conversations further and hopefully lead to the change that's required. So thank you for being part of it, and please do consider yourselves to have an ongoing role and being part of this conversation. It's not just about me or the team around it, it's about all of us. So thank you again.
Thank you. Jen or Juliet, any other things to add there?
And just add my thanks and say I spent about 2 hours yesterday with the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee talking about some of these issues and more generally, and of course, you know, there is a lot of interest in this, but one of the things that we keep saying to them is that the budget process itself is opaque. It's almost impossible to work out what's going on, so we're pushing them on openness and transparency, participation with wider civil society in Scotland, and we want to practice what we preach. So it's really great.
Okay, poor Jen, I think has been
oh well.
Sorry, Jen. Sorry, Jen, I think your internet connection there froze briefly. Thank you. Juliet, was there anything that you wanted to tell us about that you've reflected on, and that you can take forward?
I mean, I just think it's so exciting because the link between rights and well-being mean that the Uncrc Incorporation bill actually contains a lot of the mechanisms that we've been talking about today that we need to get this systemic change. So it contains a duty on Scottish ministers to do child rights impact assessments on budgets, so we can really push for the wellbeing economy through that. And this is something they have to report on every single year. I mean, that always seems really kind of top level and kind of quite far removed from children and young people's lives. But it does include duties on Scottish ministers as well to involve children and young people in their decision making. And I think that what we need to do, if we've got those structures through the Uncrc Incorporation bill, once it's passed, if it's passed in March, then what we can be doing is this kind of hearts and minds work to demonstrate why it's important, the difference it makes to the lives of children and families, and why they need to bring budget processes actually into the lives of children and young people, and make sure that they're informed by the experience of children and their families. So I just see such power between Catherine's work on the wellbeing economy and the legal provisions that mean that government have to do it. So yeah, it's so timely, and I'm really excited to be part of it.
Juliet, thanks ever so much. So really over to you, fantastic participants. Thank you. I've just been looking at the chat. There's some really great stuff there, and obviously via the Menti and contributions that we need to spend a fair amount of time looking at and building on. So thank you. But so Juliet set the challenge for all of us. It's winning hearts and minds. Pat Jackson there has said, making sure that people are persuaded not to vote in their short-term interests, but the long-term. And then I think there are others, Martin Dorchester, for example, from Include, saying, look, we need brass tacks. What are we actually going to do? We need the will to drive that. So over to you. We've got about 5 minutes or so for some specific contributions, and it'd be really great to hear you as well as read some of your work. So I think just a hands up, and Karen or the team will, if you unmute yourself and just say who you are and your specific ideas on how we make sure this report lands and achieves our goals. People seem more comfortable with chat than Menti. I could always pick on people without looking at you in terms of the chat, if that's to kick people off. Martin, you've been very articulate on chat. Could we hear your voice? Would you like to offer any advice?
I'll remind you of that in the future, Jackie, that you got me to speak.
I know you will.
Yeah, maybe one of the things, you know, I always come back to, if there's a will, then there's a way. Yeah, and I think for me the biggest challenge is that getting the will, and if government really want to do this, there is absolutely nothing that stops them doing it, and I think we need to press on that. One of the things that I thought was interesting when we worked on the care review was to put a date in the diary where we were going to, as it were, walk on Parliament, and then absolutely publicize that. So, you know, lay the gauntlet down. It's very difficult for politicians to, you know, disagree with what they know to be true, especially if you put it in a public forum like that. So, you know, I think for me, lay down a date and let's, you know, let's get our will to front up and speak. Because individually it can be quite challenging for all of us, because we're all reliant on budget and funding, and the people that we're going to press hard are the people who have the budget and the funding. But I think if we lay down a date and lay down a gauntlet, and then we walk our talk.
Thanks very much, Martin. Any others? Otherwise, I'm going to pick on a few of you who've raised some fabulous points in the chat.
Thank you. That Christine Collingwood had her hand raised there. If we could go.
Thanks, Christine. Over to you. Have you turned off mute?
Yes, I've turned off mute. Thank you. Yes, I completely agree with what Martin said about having the focus on the date, but I'm also very interested in what you've learned from Wales, and if there is anything that happened there that could be used here, because that sounded a very interesting piece of work.
Thanks, Catherine. You mentioned, but a couple of other highlights from Wales, just while others are gathering their thoughts. Would that be all right, Catherine?
There's so much to like about what Wales did, and in a way I think, yes, Scotland had the national performance framework first, but then I think Wales kind of overtook Scotland in terms of pushing this at this agenda. So they had a large consultation across the country about, you know, really what matters to the well-being of Welsh people, very creative and mixed methods. They then had the Wellbeing of Current Future Generations Act, led by people like Jane Davidson, who's just published a book on the story of what's happening there. So if you've got some reading time up your sleeve, worth having a look at Jane Davidson's book, or even some videos of her talking about it. And one of the things that's come out of that is this dedicated Office of the Future Generations Commissioner. It's a woman called Sophie Howe, and she's got a team around her, and she's got this amazing brief, is to just scrutinize government policy, every piece of government policy, according to whether it's aligned with what's needed for current and future generations in Wales. And also part of that is looking at the budget and making recommendations of the extent to which it's preventative and upstream. So I find what they're doing in Wales really, really inspiring. Obviously, it hasn't translated to nirvana yet. There's still lots of challenges in Welsh society, and poverty and inequality and so on is still in existence. But I think these are the mechanisms that we could easily learn from. And Wales, of course, is a member of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which is something that Scotland leads with New Zealand and Iceland and a few other governments, but not officially members yet, to share and exchange and learn about what each other's doing. And I'm hoping that with Wales being around that table, Scotland might start to think, yeah, we could do that too, because I think it would be brilliant to bring in that work here.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Christine. Good question. I think maybe something as well for us to think about in relation to when the final report is in. Let's bring on colleagues in Wales and others to hear how, you know, their lessons and how we might want to build on that. We've got time for a final comment, but fantastic, and really, really helpful. So it's really difficult. I want to look at the chat and I want to hear from her, but do any others want to come in for a final check? And just to reassure, people have asked, and I think Karen's just come back, that all the materials presented today will be shared on our website and sent directly to participants, so you won't lose the information that's been provided today and shared today. I can't see, Karen, is anybody else wanting to come in at this stage?
I can't see anybody, nobody has used you can, if everyone can bear in mind, we can't see you also. If you're waving at the screen, we might not see you, but down the bottom of your screen, you should see a little reactions button. So if you click on that, you can give us a wee thumbs up or a clap or something like that, a wee wave, and we'll be able to pick you up from there. There's so many of you that we can't see you all if you're waving at the screen.
Karen, it seems
Virginia
Radcliffe.
oh, sorry. Thank you, Kat. Virginia, and no pressure, but we're going to make you the last person to contribute. But I know you've been contributing to the chat, so thanks very much, Virginia. Over to you.
You know, picking up on what Juliet's been saying too, is that the Uncrc Incorporation is the most amazing opportunity to really change the lives of children and family in Scotland, and to galvanise a big debate among families, and through our creative work with families using play, you know, we find that parents are the most articulate people about what needs to change, and as are children, and I think that if we can create the structures to galvanize and make those voices heard much more and bring people together, then I think next year could be very exciting in Scotland. You know, I think that there's lots of really amazing thinking going on and practice going on, and I feel very optimistic.
Oh, Virginia, that's a great way to end this. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you very, very much for your comments, you know, participation in Menti, etc., the chat. Really, really grateful. Please don't worry. You will see the interim report. You'll be able to comment, and we'll look at running something similar to this in the new year as well in advance. I've just come up with that idea, by the way, so I'll have to talk to Katherine and the others about that, but this has been so great. I'm sure we'll all agree that that's important to do. So unless there are any final comments from Katherine, Juliet, Jen, Amy, no, we're fine. Okay, well, the session was due to end at 11:45. We've ended on time, and please do join us if you can at 12:30 for our annual general meeting, and particularly please do join us again at 2 o'clock for our launch of our manifesto, where children and young people who've developed this alongside our policy participation and projects team and all our members, many of our members who've contributed to that launch is really exciting, and thank you very much for your support of that, and looking forward to seeing you back then. So thank you so much for a great session, and thanks in particular to Katherine, of course, to Jen, to Juliet and Amy, and the fantastic events team, Karen, Kat, Nazmi and Svenja, for making this session go so well. Thank you very, very much, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye. Thank you.